And Sabina, when you do take the question forward, we're also talking about any specific challenges that have emerged recently, in more recent times, and we're talking about post-COVID.
Shahzad Saab has kind of elaborated on in the entire experience, the migration itself, and the reintegration processes. And there are obviously a lot of gendered-based differences. So experiences of men and women and people of different sexual orientation will be different, and they will experience everything very differently, which means that they will have a different set of needs when it comes to especially reintegration. So how our processes currently, or our systems or mechanisms currently, how gendered they are, how sensitive they are to these differences, to the differential experiences. I think that is one discussion that needs to really take place. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of body of research on any gender analysis of those experiences. So, and the data, as Sir mentioned, is already very scarce. So we don't even know the exact number of people who return. This also depends a lot on the migration situation, the type of migration that takes place. It's, if it's irregular, obviously those numbers are not documented. Also in terms of reintegration, I think the type of reintegration, if it's forced or it's voluntary, if people have experienced exploitation or violence during the journey, all of that shapes the kind and the need of support they would eventually need when they are back in their countries of origin. This will mean that their need has to be obviously very contextualized to their experiences, what they have experienced, especially if it's violence, if it's exploitation, even if it's labor work conditions which are not conducive, they have been through a difficult migration journeys. The need for a very focused, very migrant sort of focused reintegration process, I would say, needs to be there, needs to be in place. So speaking from the gender perspective, I think the prime focus would be looking at those different needs, sort of addressing that through policy, through mechanisms, information needs, as you said. Women would obviously not have the same access to information sources. They would not know where to go to get, for example, redressal, which institutions to go to in terms of legal support, for example, if they're looking at documentation, for economic reintegration, which institutions, which mechanisms to sort of go to, if you're looking at, sort of sliding back into the economic situation. All of that information, we don't see a lot of institutional support, especially in reaching out to women. Dependence only on a few means, say, for example, only digital means would not have the same, sort of level of access to everyone. So whatever we do in terms of how we can successfully and sustainably reintegrate migrants, particularly women migrants, we need to really look at what their needs are currently. And as I said, there's not enough research, there's not enough analysis of what those differential needs are. We know through anecdotal, sort of incidents, we know through some body of research, but not a lot that's been done. And hence we see policies which are not primarily, sort of focused on those needs.
Thank you very much for that. And Sabina, would you like to add anything to that?
Just a point that overall there is also a lot of feminization of migration, as we say. Women tend to, and that's also true for the general market structures and general, sort of labor market situation, even in our country. We tend to believe that women are suitable for only a certain set of jobs. So things are considered appropriate for them or not appropriate for them. They also tend to self-select themselves into choosing professions which they think are a natural sort of a projection of their own roles. So you'll see a lot of women in care industry. That's seen as a natural sort of progression of their reproductive role. Again, the trend in migration, you'll also notice that women will go in care industry or beauty industry and, as domestic
workers, yes.
Exactly, because that's seen as a appropriate, again, extension of their roles. And these, unfortunately, these occupations tend to be low wage, low skill ones. They will be outside of the labor laws in most cases, especially when you're talking about domestic work. the labor laws would not be applicable there. So there are issues of social protection, there are issues of work conditions, there is risk of exploitation. So all that sort of feeds into this whole cycle of then where women will go, how will they end up, and if they have to come back to their countries of origin, what is that they would have gone through. This is something that that is the larger context one needs to understand, so that whatever we decide in terms of policy or actions, it has to be really, sort of in line with what the situation is out there. Can I just add it?
Please do.
So one of the little research that is available, I was looking through it, it's done by ILO, and it's basically a very qualitative study, but one of the findings actually really struck me also. Most of the women, and I'm sure that would be the experience which resonates in the room, people who have been very closely involved with the issue and the subject, most of the women choose to not use the institutional channels for aid. They are not accessible in terms of information. They prefer to use informal channels. So a lot of women migrants would go because a job opportunity has been identified by somebody they knew in some country. It doesn't go through the official channel. So there is both the demand side, sort of deficit in women not actively reaching out because there are no institutions which are easily accessible to them. And this again puts them at high risk because it is undocumented, it is an informal channel, promises are made, but then how they would end up, it's outside the purview of, of the institutional legal frameworks, of course, hide the risks. So.
Taking the same point aspect forward, we're talking about a lack of conducive policies and a lack of awareness being two crucial issues which can be and should be addressed immediately. So how can policies and what kind of policies would you suggest to be developed to enhance support and facilities? Do we need to increase the number of facilitation channels or centers? How can it be made more accessible for women? What would you like to suggest?
Please.
So the first, I would say, if you're looking at the policy, I think three things to do. I would say sensitization, and sensitization.
Okay.
So the policy makers need to be sensitized, the communities need to be sensitized, all the decision makers, institutions, they need to be first sensitized to this whole idea of, gender differences in experiences, in needs, and that has to reflect in everything that we either make as policy or things that we do as practice. Most crucial thing. The other thing is all this support has to be very, especially when we talk about the reintegration support, it has to be very timely. It has to be very converged. It has to be integrated. One of the things that was observed was so we have the economic reintegration, we have social, psychosocial reintegration, all these different dimensions.
Yes.
If people were to choose, they would pick the economic reintegration and at the cost of psychosocial, if it was kind of if they had to choose between the two. And we know that the psychosocial reintegration is as critical, the social integration part is as critical, as the economic reintegration. So one of the things is to package things in a way where you are able to sort of offer them in a more holistic, integrated way. So don't make them choose if they want to do this or that. It should come as a package and everyone should have equitable access to it. So I think one of the policy principle is perhaps not delaying it, doing it in a more institutional structured way, doing it in an integrated way, converging that, making it accessible. People going from one place to the other, that also is a barrier, especially for women when you're looking at issues in mobility, information also, where to go. So all of that has to be packaged in a way where it is very integrated. It is one window. I think we have great examples from the project itself where one window operation, it's very useful, it's very helpful. It cuts out on the, the information barrier, the mobility barriers. It's accessible, it is safe. So I think that would be the policy principle.
Do you think, again, on the same line, Sabina, I'll address this question to you. How do you think educational and training opportunities be made more accessible for women? Because it will help lay the groundwork for their socioeconomic reintegration. How do you think one should go about providing those education and training opportunities, considering that, again, there is a social stigmatization, as you said, there is a feminization, there is a lack of sensitization. How would you address this question?
So one would look at all the three levels that sort of surround this whole discourse. So there are, when we're talking about vulnerable groups, we're talking about generally men also who have, who return from difficult situations and experience in migration. We are looking at generally the women. There would be three sort of layers to the way I would see things. The first one is trying to understand at the individual level, where are the problems? As we said, and this is also true for the general labor market in Pakistan, we have a general education deficit. So people in the labor force they have low levels of education. Most of the people would be less than 8 years of education completed. So we start with a disadvantage. So even in the labor market, we have an education deficit, particularly pronounced in the case of women. And then there are also at the individual levels issues in terms of self-confidence. We don't get a chance to have transversal skills early on in our life skills. So that puts you at a disadvantage when you are competing in a labor market, whether it's in Pakistan or abroad. So that's where the individual level sort of barriers kind of come in. Then at the institutional level, we are looking at things we've already talked about, the information channels not being accessible, not being equitable in terms of their outreach, that. The delivery mechanism, the skills and education as we're talking about, unfortunately, we have a lot of supply side issues. For one, the access to skills training is very limited. We have only about 18,000 institutions. That's what the website and SIS tells you. 18,000 institutions across Pakistan, about less than 5 lakh, training places in there. I mean, we have colleagues from the TVET sector sitting here who, sort of also agree with that. In terms of access, the numbers are very limited. The outreach to women, the institutions for women, or female-focused trades, for example, is very limited. So access issues. Then we look at the TVET provision itself. As I said earlier, it's very gendered in the sense that certain women would have traditional skills training available. The opportunities would be either beautician or tailoring or embroidery. Not a lot of market-driven courses are offered to women. So that also puts you at a disadvantage when you're looking at entering in a market, or even if you're looking at starting out something.
Lack of relevance.
Lack of relevance. And especially market-driven. We keep, even in one place, if we just keep rolling out the same courses, you will have a saturation at the end of the day, especially when you're looking at the smaller, cities, for example. So the market research part is completely absent. We don't have market needs mapped, and hence the courses are very supply driven. We also heard that in the morning. NAFTA TC ED was sort of alluding to the same point, that is a very supply driven provision currently. That puts you at a disadvantage. You end up choosing professions, going to skills training, which will not lead to a healthy employment outcomes. So again, putting yourself there. And then there are the contextual challenges. This would be more in terms of the social, cultural factors, the mobility issues that sort of prohibit women from making the choices that they want to make when it comes to choosing a career or the decision to migrate or not to migrate. The decision-making locus will not be with the women in a household, in a typical, in our society. Even the decision of deciding what to do with their lives in terms of choosing a career, if they should go abroad or not go abroad, this is not a decision that most of the women will be able to make independently. So all these factors sort of feed into what eventually choices people make. I think it could also be because of the situation of migration, the migration experience, especially if it's irregular, obviously, and if there is debt involved in terms of people who have accrued it for the migration purpose, they come back. So it's not so much as stigma, but there are issues in terms of acceptance. There are issues in terms of support that they would receive from their families. Depends on their migration situation. And if they've come back from situations of exploitation and abuse particularly, that would also impact that dynamic.
Thank you very much. With that, we will need to close this panel session. I thank our panelists for their insights, which have been very, very valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, we will take 5 before we start the next panel session. Thank you.